fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am very excited to share the books that I read in the month of January with you. I read a lot of really great books this month, more than usual, in fact, which is making up for how terrible my reading month in February is, but more on that in the February wrap-up, which hopefully there will be one. I did actually finish at least one book in February, so there will be a wrap-up. Anyway, let's get on to the wonderful books that I read in the month of January. The first book that I read is The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. This book follows a series of characters during the London Blitz. The first part introduces us to characters in 1947, after the war has ended, and we see the aftermath of World War II and how it has affected the social landscape of London and our characters. And then we trace our characters back through time to 1944 and then back again to 1941 to see how their lives got the way they were in 1947 and how they've really changed throughout the course of the war. It's a bit of a strange narrative structure, the way the story is told in reverse, but also in many ways, it's a much more character-driven book than a plot-driven one. So it's really interesting to see the character development happen in reverse. I felt that it was a bit slow in the beginning, and maybe while I was reading, I was a little disappointed that it was so character-driven because Sarah Waters has a reputation in my mind for books with a really thrilling plot. You know, Fingersmith is an insanely plot-driven book, and it was my first introduction to Sarah Waters. So, for the most part, Sarah Waters let the action of the plot in this book come from the war. There was actually a lot of wonderful historical detail about the Blitz and how the war affected the British home front in particular, which I really appreciated because it's not an aspect of World War II that I've ever studied before, and certainly not in detail. I'm not that familiar with the Blitz, so I really ended up loving all of that rich historical detail. I also ended up loving that as time moved backwards, I learned more about the characters and was able to piece together information from earlier sections. I really didn't think that the narrative structure was going to work for me, but it kind of did in the end. Most of all, this book is about how the characters cope with the shared trauma of the war, and specifically living under the constant threat of the Blitz. As I was reading this book, I had trouble fully enjoying it, and I couldn't figure out why for the longest time. It was impeccably written, the narrative structure was just fascinating, really. The characters were interesting, and yet there was really something very unsettling about reading it. Finally, I realized that I was drawing uncomfortable parallels between the situations in this book and living through the current pandemic. I'm not saying that the Blitz is like COVID, because it definitely is not. There are some obvious, stark differences there. But the way that the characters are coping with a shared trauma of the war reminds me of the ways in which people in our society are coping with the shared trauma of dealing with the pandemic. That may not make so much sense to you, but I will read you a quote and hopefully you'll understand what I mean a little better. I'm not going to give you character context here. All you have to know is we are celebrating someone's birthday during the Blitz. She sat down again with her book, but found she couldn't settle to it. She tried a magazine. Her gaze slid over the words on the page and took nothing in. The idea began to rise in her that she was wasting time. It was her birthday in wartime. She might never have another. You can't expect to have a special day in wartime, Kay had said that afternoon. But why couldn't you? How long did they have to go on, letting the war spoil everything? They had been patient all this time. They'd lived in darkness. They'd lived without salt, without scent. They'd fed themselves little scraps of pleasure, like parings of cheese. Now she became aware of the minutes as they passed. She felt them, suddenly, for what they were, as fragments of her life, her youth, that were rushing away like so many drops of water, never to return. So that passage is, of course, about, celebrating a birthday during World War II and during the Blitz, but a lot of that can translate into the current situation with the pandemic. I mean, how many times have I sat down to read a book and was unable to focus and thought that I was just wasting time? I mean, there are 3 months of my life that I didn't work, but I also didn't enjoy myself. I feel like those were wasted months. There's this, perception that we've been so good, we've been so patient, we've worn masks, we've done everything right, and when will it end? And that's really what resonated with me with this book. And once I started to understand that those were the parallels I was drawing, I started to appreciate this book a lot more, and I started to understand what this book is about. It's about society coping with a shared trauma, and it's done impeccably. I love Sarah Waters' books, and I can't wait to read more. This was my first Sarah Waters book that was not part of her Victorian series. In a way, it's not really a series, but it didn't take place in Victorian times, and she has 2 other books that are like that, The Paying Guests and The Little Stranger, and I can't wait to read those as well. In January, I also read The Subtle Knife by Philip Pullman and The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. So this was my first time reading the His Dark Material series, and that is big. How did I wait so long to read this series? I haven't the faintest idea. I did read the first book in the series, The Golden Compass, in January 2020. And then I did not pick up the rest of the series until now. Why? Again, I have no idea why. I absolutely loved the first book and the world and the characters it created. I think I was a bit scared, actually, because I know how beloved this series is by so many, and I was afraid to pick it up in case I didn't like it the way others do, perhaps. My brain works in mysterious ways sometimes, but I am so glad that I read this series. This trilogy is truly what children's fiction should aspire to. It's immensely readable, and it keeps you enthralled in the world and the characters in the fun and whimsical way that all of the best children's books do. But it also explores really deep theological issues, the story of the fall of man, questions of good and evil, of God's existence, of death. And these are not light topics, and they're not topics you expect to find in a children's book, but they are handled in a way that children can access them. And yet, I could see this trilogy being taught and analyzed in the college setting as well. Stick it alongside, Milton's Paradise Lost or Blake's poetry, maybe some Dante or some C.S. Lewis, and you could have a syllabus going here. This is a series that lends itself to multiple readings at various stages of life, and I'm a bit disappointed that I missed out on reading it when I was younger. I'll never have that nostalgia for the story that comes with reading a book when you're younger. I'll never develop a crush on Will, as I'm sure so many kids did, and as I'm sure I would have as well if I had read this in my early teens. And I'll never invent some make-believe game with demons and other worlds, which I definitely would have done as well had I read this when I was younger. I actually invented a whole game in my backyard based on the book Bridge to Terabithia when I was a kid. I had a very active imagination, and I'm sure these books would have impacted my development in ways that I can't even begin to imagine. But I'm glad that I did finally read this series. It's definitely a new favorite of mine, and it's a series that I want to revisit from time to time. In case you too have been living under a rock, I will give you a brief description about what this series is all about. In the first book, The Golden Compass, we meet 11-year-old Lyra, a brave and inquisitive girl who lives among the academics of Oxford's Jordan College. She eavesdrops on a meeting of scholars and learns about a mysterious celestial phenomenon called dust. Lyra gets caught up in a quest to understand dust and ends up in a struggle involving stolen children, witch clans, and armored bears. The second book continues Lyra's quest to uncover the mysteries of dust and introduces us to a second protagonist, Will. And then the third book pulls all of the threads of this series together into an epic battle with a really thoughtful ending. In Lyra's world, everyone has a demon companion in animal form, something so profoundly connected with them that the two are almost part of the same soul. Children's demons constantly change form to suit the child's needs, but as one ages, their demon settles into a more permanent form, an animal that best represents who they are as a person. This series has such a wonderful dichotomy between children and adults, where the children are actually sometimes more astute and knowledgeable than the adults. It's a hallmark of children's literature to have some sort of dichotomy or misunderstanding between children and adults, but this book takes that a step further by introducing the concept of original sin and having our main characters grapple with religion, morality, mortality, and the concept of a soul. And in the process of facing all of these really challenging topics, they grow up. This series is a masterpiece on so many levels. I read these last two on audiobook, which was wonderful because Philip Pullman narrates them himself along with a full cast, but I also might want to do a reread at some point in print and be able to pull out some of these amazing quotes that I listened to, because the writing is actually exquisite, and there's definitely a lot of things that I listened to that I wish I could just capture somehow. I might also want to try to talk about these more at some point with spoilers and such, but I don't know. It's quite a task. So I would love to hear about your experience with this series. Did you read these books when you were young, or did you come to them later in life like I did? How have these books impacted you as a person? The next book that I read, or rather finished in January, because I started this one, I think, in nonfiction November, and then didn't pick it up for a while, is Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mikki Kendall. This was actually a gift from Acacia Ives. I'll link her channel down below. She always gives me the best gifts, and I finally got around to reading this one, and I'm so glad that I did. It is a nonfiction book all about how the mainstream feminist movement excludes the needs of women who are not white, middle, upper class. So in short, not me. Feminism as a movement seems to prioritize increasing the privilege of the already privileged upper middle class rather than on the general survival of all women. It's this concept of trickle-down equality, that the more rights white females achieve, the more rights all females will achieve, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. And many issues that should really be feminist issues, because they're about the basic survival of women, aren't viewed as feminist issues. Things like food insecurity, access to quality education, making a living wage, access to quality medical care. These topics usually disproportionately affect women of color or women who fall outside the categories of cisgender or heterosexual. I think the opening of this book is particularly brilliant. It's what got me into reading it. It's the discussion of the author's own grandmother, how she was a feminist role model to the author, and yet she never would have approved of that label because so much of the feminist rhetoric of her own time period was laden with racist and classist assumptions. So this book just uses examples from the author's own life in really powerful ways. And this book isn't meant to be an autobiography by any means, but she would be talking about these issues from an abstract point of view and then work in some surprising life experience. Kendall also works a lot of current references or references to events and news and politics from the past 5 years or so. It makes the book very current, but I worry that it might also end up dating the book over time. This book has so many interesting points and facets, But one really interesting point that Kendall made was the power of men and the patriarchy, because not all men have the same power within the patriarchy as cis white men do. And that plays out in really complicated ways when it comes to feminism that addresses the needs of women who are not white upper middle class. Women of color might turn to the men in their lives as partners against racism, but at the same time, those men might be a source of sexism or misogyny. Women of color aren't always able to prioritize their gender over race or over class, and that shouldn't make them any less feminist. This book opened up my mind to what feminism truly means and the limitations to the brand of feminism that I've been taught to accept. Lately, I've been seeing a lot about Bell Hooks on Instagram, probably because she passed away this past December, but I think her writing, from what I've heard, might be interesting to think about alongside this author's and alongside this book. And I'm looking forward to that, because this isn't some new idea. Bell Hooks talked about this years ago, but this is an idea that is not disseminated in the mainstream feminist movement. And it should be, because intersectionality is very complicated, and it's something that I'm still trying to grasp and learn and navigate. And I would not want to be a part of a movement that alienates people in the way that this book expresses that feminism has. The next book I'd like to talk about is Love in Color by Bolu Babalola. This is a series of short stories which are retellings of myths from all different cultures, mostly non-Western cultures. I think there are stories from Nigeria and Persia, other African countries, Mali, Senegal, Egypt, China, and Mesopotamia, and I'm sure that there are plenty more countries that are represented here. These stories are stories about love and relationships in many forms, and they feature characters of color. There are also a lot of feminist twists to the retellings as well. I really enjoyed listening to this on audiobook, but as a whole, I feel really mixed about this collection. It's funny, I read it first, and then I was chatting about it with Katie from Books and Things, and she ended up reading it as well, and she ended up liking it slightly less than I did, but we both had very mixed opinions on the book itself and on the various stories. These stories cover a lot of different types of love and different aspects of relationship, like trust and respect. A lot of women in these tales are very powerful, confident women, and the stories, many of them, are about being loved in a way that's really being seen for who you truly are, and about finding someone who recognizes these characters' strength and their power, their talents, and about finding someone who not only loves them for those talents, but encourages them to pursue them and to embrace themselves for things that others fear or shun. It's a really lovely message about self-love, and I think there are a lot of really great stories in here with that message. A lot of the stories, despite having very modern trappings of high school and college and cell phones and marketing jobs and such, they feel very mythical and fairy tale-esque. And of course, I liked some stories a lot more than others, so some that stick out to me are the one about two childhood friends who drift apart mainly because of one's self-consciousness about her vitiligo. There's one about this political power couple where the main character has to truly examine if this relationship is working for her. Like I said, I listened to this one on audiobook, and there were definitely some pros and cons to that. I feel like these stories were meant to be heard rather than written down and read in print. They come from myths and legends and, oral tradition in general. So there's that aspect to it. But I also don't think that the writing style would have worked for me in print. I think the text might have come across as trite or cliche that way, but it worked for me while listening to it. The author actually narrates part of the book, and I feel like she probably had a lot of input in the audio production as well. Of course, the issue with audiobooks of short stories, and I've encountered this before, so it's not an issue with the book per se, but it's hard to tell where one story ends and the next begins. And I should clarify that I mean two different things by that. I mean, quite literally, one, that I think I'm still listening to the last story, but a new story has started. And this happens a lot of times because, I'm driving while I read an audiobook. It's hard to realize that the audiobook has actually gone on to the next chapter. There's no musical interlude to say that one story has ended. There's no change in narrators sometimes, and so it's actually difficult, quite literally, to tell that you are in a new story. But I also mean that it's hard to tell where one story ends and the next begins thematically. A lot of times, and this happens in print too, when I finish with a whole collection, the stories seem to blend together, and I have trouble remembering individual ones and individual characters, and I just sort of take the whole book as a story in and of itself, even though it is made up of a lot of individual short stories. And the reason for this is because I'm listening to them so close together. And as I'm listening to it on audiobook and as I'm driving, it's not like I can pause and think about each story before I move on to the next one. The same thing happens when I read a short story collection in print and don't stop in between each story. Sometimes with short stories, the best thing I can do is actually take a day in between each story and really mull it over. I find that that's how they stick with me best. But of course, in the audiobook format, that isn't really possible. I mean, you could press pause, but it's not exactly safe for me while driving. So yes. At least with this collection, it was clear when the next story was starting. There was a very long pause, the narrator changed, and it really helped me actually that all the stories' titles were names. But like I said, I wasn't able to stop and digest a bit between each story, and so all the plots and themes really blend together in my mind. Still, there were a lot of stories that I do remember and I absolutely loved in this collection. I think my favorites were Psyche and Thisbe, and Nefertiti and Sisu. But there were a lot of characters from other stories that stick with me as well. I actually enjoyed Sisu, I think, even more once I finished the book, because at the end there was this incredible author's note that just provided more context into the original story and the way that the author chose to manipulate that story. I do think I would have gotten a lot more out of the collection if there was either some very brief version of the original stories included or an author's note after each one to explain some of the author's thoughts and, what she has changed and manipulated. And there's definitely a big part of me that actually wants to research these original tales and then listen to these stories again. I think it would make some of the stories that I didn't feel connected to even more interesting. But still, I got plenty of value from this collection without knowledge of the originals. And I just really enjoyed it overall. I wouldn't say it's a 5-star book, but, 3 or 4. It's a solid collection. And I do think it is this author's debut. So I can't wait to see what she writes in the future. And last but not least, in the month of January, I read Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is the only Octavia E. Butler book that I've ever read, and I think it's her most famous, and I really, really loved this one. This book is about Dana, an African-American woman living in the late 70s in LA. She has just moved into a new apartment with her husband, Kevin, and she's unpacking when suddenly she travels back in time to antebellum Maryland with slaves before the Civil War. A very, very dangerous place for an African-American woman to visit. While she's there, she saves a young white boy from drowning. And after that, she's inexplicably whisked back home. She is brought back to the past again shortly, where she realizes that her task is to save the life of this white man, who turns out to be her ancestor. And she does this over and over and over again. The more she goes back in time, the longer she stays, and she sees this ancestor of hers grow up and change and be affected by the slave society. This book really examines the ways in which social mechanisms enabled slavery in the southern states. It's really interesting, the relationship between Dana and her ancestor, because he has such power over her. He owns her, but also she has the power of life and death over him. We examine her ancestor, and it's mentioned, there's a quote, it says, "He wasn't a monster at all, just an ordinary man who sometimes did the monstrous things his society said were legal and proper." And when you think about it, this character, her ancestor, is just a product of his time. He doesn't do anything that is illegal. He doesn't do anything that is even particularly mean for a plantation owner or a slave owner. But the things that he does, to us coming from a modern day view, are horrific and brutal and uncalled for and unfair. And there's a lot of talk about fairness in here. It's just so interesting to see the way that this society functions and the way that this character changes over time. The main character in this book is a symbol of, a present modern day African American woman. She's made stronger from her heritage, but she also still bears the scars of past wrongs. And it's really fascinating to see how she actually goes back in time and sees two ancestors. She sees one who's white and she sees one who's black. And it's interesting how the story focuses on her relationship with her white ancestor specifically, rather than her black ancestor. I think that was a brilliant choice on Butler's part. This book was so immensely readable. I absolutely devoured it. In fact, I may have stayed up till 2 a.m. one night just to finish it, because it is written in a way that is just so accessible, and the plot just unfolds so quickly that you can't help but be drawn to this book. And I couldn't put it down until I finished it, because I wanted to know how it would end. How would Dana escape this cycle? Will she be stuck in time? That type of thing. And another really interesting thing about this book is it's not about time travel. It is, but it's not about the mechanism of time travel. We don't spend time discussing how this is possible. We don't spend time looking into the physics or the science of it. The characters simply accept time travel at face value, accept that this happens, and deal with the effects of it. It's a brilliant book. It's not an easy book to read, but it also is. It's not an easy book thematically. It's an easy book to sit down and consume. And I love so much about it. I think it explores its characters and its themes really beautifully. I think it purposely gives such depth and life to all of its African American characters. And then the ending of this book. The ending of this book is just so emotional and so brilliant. I am such a fan. This book may end up being one of my favorites of the year. Actually, a lot of the books I read in January may end up being one of my favorites of the year. It was an amazing reading month in January. So yes. That is all I have to talk about in terms of books that I finished, but there are a few books that I am still in the middle of, if I can find them. Okay, here we go. So I am in the middle of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. I am reading this along with a whole bunch of booktubers, including my co-hosts for the Wolf Hall Along, Emily from Novel Novels and Tori from Hufflepuff Discoveries. I'll link their channels below. I will link the announcement video where we said we were reading this down below. It is quite a big and daunting series. It's quite a big book, actually. But I'm almost all the way through it, and I can't wait to discuss my thoughts with them on a live Zoom chat at some point in the near future. Yeah, so this book is just epic. That is the word for it. It's epic on so many proportions and so many levels, and it's kind of like a political thriller in a way. It reminds me in some ways of the TV show House of Cards on Netflix. You know, Henry VIII's court is just a den of thieves, and we get to watch as Thomas Cromwell works his way up from nothing and develops the skills to infiltrate this pit of snakes, if you will. So it's absolutely wonderful. Of course, religion plays a huge role in politics of the time period, so there is a lot of discussion of religion in this, and a lot of discussion of power and how one obtains power. Is it by force or is it by wit? It's just such a fascinating book, and I will be talking a lot more about it on the channel, especially once I finish it. So there's that. And then also I've been reading The Haunting Season, Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights. This book has a lot of short stories written by pretty much all my favorite historical fiction authors, British historical fiction authors specifically. We've got stories by Bridget Collins, Imogen Hermes Gower, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, one that I haven't heard of, so I'm going to skip it, Jess Kidd, Elizabeth McNeil, Natasha Pulley, and Laura Purcell. And I've been really enjoying these so far. I will, of course, be sharing a lot more about this once I finished it, and I can't wait to discuss it with you guys, probably in February's wrap-up. So that is all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this wrap-up. I hope you also had a wonderful January. I know this is a bit of a belated video, but what were your favorite reads from the month of January? What are you currently reading? What did you think of the books I talked about? You know me, I love hearing all of your comments and thoughts. So do let me know what you are thinking and what you are reading. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye.